this whole idea of colonizing the underground, moving into the earth, is something I became totally fascinated by. I do meet a lot of people that worked for the government or they were in the military, and they saw things that worried them. He was doing work for the Department of Defense, building bunkers for them, and when he realized what they were building them for, he knew what he was doing when he left. I imagine that part of the reason that we hold back on any sort of military intervention in North Korea is because we don't know what's underground. These are huge facilities, yeah, underground cities, weapons factories, like the whole country's underground. What we see on the surface, what we see in satellite images is not what exists. It's kind of mind-boggling to imagine how much stuff is buried in the crust of the earth that we know nothing about. You get into someone else's culture, you start to see the world through their eyes, and it changes you as a researcher. I started feeling more confident about taking risks, and then eventually just resigned from academia altogether. And I'm not saying that's because I started prepping, but it had something to do with it, generally.
I have a feeling that, you're gonna stumble on some information that you're not supposed to know.
I usually do. You spend long enough thinking about something and you start revealing things you're not supposed to know.
All right, guys, so today's guest on the channel is Dr. Bradley Garrett. He's the author of the book Bunker, Building for the End Times. He's written over 50 academic journals and has been on notable podcasts like the Joe Rogan Experience. In his research, he's followed prepping and survival communities across 4 continents, and he's visited some of the most obscure bunkers and underground fortresses on Earth, many that required secret entry. Now, interestingly, when he set out to write his book, he was quite skeptical of preppers, but ultimately he became one, and he took some time away from his cabin in the woods to come down to the studio for a chat. His unique findings and insights are indispensable in understanding this massive cultural shift that we are seeing towards preparing for an age of calamity and crisis. Time is running out, so let's get to it.
Bradley Garrett, cultural geographer. What is a cultural geographer?
Cultural geography is sort of like an intersection between anthropology and geography. So I work with physical geographers often that are studying rocks, basically, and I study people and their relationships to places.
So it's a nice match. This is why you're studying preppers, is because you're studying the rocks, the bunker aspect, and then you're also studying the people aspect.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, this whole idea of, colonizing the underground, moving into the earth is something I became totally fascinated by. And also, I used to be an archaeologist. That was my master's degree was in archaeology before I did my PhD in geography. I like thinking about the bunker as an artifact. Like if a civilization came in 1,000 years and they were like, what were these people doing? Why did they dig this stuff up? Why did they build these underground spaces? So that's part of the fascination for sure.
That's one of the things that will likely withstand any sort of calamity. I guess that's what they're built for. Because they're underground, they're not going to succumb to erosion and all this stuff. So if we ever were to dig something up, thousands of years from now, it'll probably be that, right?
They'll be there. Yeah. These are enduring artifacts. I mean, look at the bunkers that were built during the Cold War. They're all still rock solid. In fact, a lot of people are buying those bunkers now and turning them into private bunkers rather than government bunkers. I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah, I have a friend who did that very thing, actually.
Yeah.
So yeah,
well, that's a good money saver. Let the taxpayer build it, and then you can buy it for pennies on the dollar a few decades later. And because if you imagine the expense of actually pouring that much concrete, trying to build a bunker like that. I mean, it's astronomical. It's most people could never afford that.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, the governments all over the world have spent enormous sums of money building these things. So it's like, well, if you can, what do they do with them? Once they become known or, they're not deep enough for current nuclear weapons or whatever, they get declassified. There's so many reasons why a government says, okay, this is no longer useful for us. So yeah, get your own bunker.
Yeah. So you are the author of the book bunker, what it takes to survive the apocalypse. And I have to say, when I first read the book, there were certain points of contention and very, I would say, trivial criticisms I had of the book. But overall, this is, I think, the most comprehensive analysis of prepping culture out there. And you don't just, speak from the perspective of an armchair enthusiast. You're actually out there experiencing the bunkers, talking with all of the key notable figures within the preparedness community. And you've put together a book which I think everybody has to read, especially if you're a prepper, because it really puts things in perspective. I mean, everybody's got to go and get this book, okay? Every chapter is so dense with information that you never get bored, and that's rare in my experience. Like, to have it up until the last minute, and the last chapter is one of the best, because that's where you go into one of the most elaborate bunker systems, and you're explaining your experiences in the last few chapters. So, I mean, what motivated you to write this book?
Well, first, let me just say thanks. I'm definitely, I don't shy away from criticism. So if, we can get into the things you didn't like as well, but I really appreciate that you enjoyed the book. And I did try and write it so that each chapter could live on its own. I mean, if you're right. Like, so many books, you get halfway through them and you're like, do I need this information?
Yeah.
They just, like, they're bloated.
You get the gist of it.
Yeah. And there were a couple of chapters that I got rid of. I got to the final draft and I was like, you know what? It's just not that interesting. So I'm gonna ditch a chapter, and it is painful to do that after you've spent years working on a project. But you have to get rid of your ego and just think about the reader. So I got a 3-year research fellowship from the University of Sydney to write this book. And I was kind of blown away. I submitted it as a research proposal, and they gave me full funding for 3 years to work on this project. And I had enough in the bank there that I knew I could fly all over the world. I could, meet who I wanted to meet. And that was kind of the goal. I wanted to learn about prepping from the inside of the culture, but I also wanted to see people prepping in different countries, and different, with different cultural backgrounds. People that ran the gamut from building, super elaborate private bunkers to people who were, doing homesteading and practical prepping. I wanted to get a picture of the culture. So yeah, that's what I attempted to do. And it was an amazing journey. Took me 3 years. I went to 8 different countries. I interviewed about 100 people. I spent a lot of time, living on people's properties, living in their bunkers. It was wild. And like any good research, it changed me as well, because it's, I don't know, it's the beautiful thing about a long-term project, right? Is you get into someone else's culture, you start to see the world through their eyes, and it changes you as a researcher.
And before that, you had written a book about the underground cities of London, or what it was, the subterranean Cold War era bunkers of London. Yeah,
so that was part of it. My books, so I always start with culture. That's where the cultural geographer comes from, the cultural geography comes from. It's I was doing research with urban explorers in London, people that were sneaking into off-limits places. And so they were interested in going into abandoned buildings, sewer systems, infrastructural tunnels, abandoned metro stations. And initially I was just sort of following them, like trying to understand like what motivates you to want to go into these places? Like, why do you want to see them? Why do you want to photograph them? Why do you want to share this with everyone? And then, as with this project, over time, I became an urban explorer and I became deeply fascinated with all of this stuff. And a lot of the work that we did was in London, which is just a phenomenal city for underground exploration, because for the past 250 years, there's just been endless opening up and boring out of the city. So now there's essentially 5 layers underneath London. So
Really?
you can buy a manhole key on Amazon and go into the streets of London and open up a manhole and get into a sewer system that was built in the mid 19th century, and it's all hand laid brick down there. 318 million hand laid bricks.
And is it just for sewers, or
utterly
is
gorgeous.
was there a bunker aspect to this?
Yeah, so under the sewers, you've got electricity, telecommunications, fiber optics, water, so all your basic infrastructure. You've got the tube under that. And then what happens during World War II is London's getting bombed, and so they start building these bomb shelters and connecting them to the tube system. So if you sneak into the tube at night and find the right connection points, you can get to bunkers from the tube system. And these are World War II and then later Cold War bunkers. And there are some incredibly elaborate Cold War bunkers underneath the city that we were able to get access to that had like medical facilities and bunk beds and stockpiled supplies. It's all still down there.
Wow.
So I guess, in a way, working with these urban explorers, the bunkers were one of the things that really like stuck with me. Like what a weird cultural artifact this is. And so when I realized that there was this emerging cultural movement of people, building their own bunkers or colonizing those old government spaces, I wanted to know more, and that's the rabbit hole.
So do you think, this is good information for any of our viewers in London right now who are a little concerned about the situation in Europe. You might want to familiarize yourself with these spaces. It's illegal to go into these spaces, though? Is that the thing?
It's a gray area.
It's a gray area.
So trespass in England isn't a criminal offense. But if you go into government installations or, in the tube, actually it is.
And you said there's a key that you need to get into the sewers?
We had all sorts of keys.
Wow.
We had
the keys to the city.
Yeah.
The underground city.
Yeah, I had an amazing key ring and then a lockpick set and then some other tools for heavier work if necessary, right. That hopefully are never deployed. But, the other thing is like, sometimes we would start digging into layers and we weren't sure, like if we closed a door, if it was going to lock behind us or whatever, so you'd like prop doors open, but you could get stuck underground. And so, just as a matter of precaution, like we would try not to damage anything, but having a,
it's like urban caving.
Yeah. So, you might have the, battery powered angle grinder in the backpack. You don't want to use it, but if you get stuck somewhere, you might have to get yourself out because obviously there's no mobile reception down there.
Because a lot of people, they're worried if there was a major nuclear incident, like where would you go if you were in the city? So I think, what you're saying is maybe this is not only something that's unique to London, but there's these underground sewer systems and possibly even levels down that people could potentially access in a emergency like that most people are oblivious to. Is this common knowledge in London that there's?
I would say so.
Yeah.
I would say
even with the new generation,
most people know it's there, but they don't know how to access it. And so that's just a matter of training the eyes, looking for ventilation shafts, for instance, and then we would actually like sniff the ventilation shafts to figure out whether it was a bunker or a tube vent or whatever, because you can smell the brake dust from the trains.
Okay.
And then if you get this kind of musty, earthy smell, then maybe it's a bunker,
Interesting.
So you get
a nose
so
for
train the nose and then train the eyes, and then you start to see all this stuff. And after years of exploring the city, I kind of have like a 3-dimensional map in my head of the city, and I kind of know how to get into each layer and how one layer connects to another. But yeah, I do think it's useful practical knowledge. And when I was later living in Australia, I did meet one guy who knew of a World War II bunker that had been bricked up, and his bug out plan was actually to go to that bunker with a sledgehammer and open that thing up and get inside, which is, it makes sense. That's what it was built for, right?
So in that led you into wanting to know more about actual bunker culture. So you have this obsession with under the earth. Do you consider yourself a prepper at this point?
So when I when I started writing the book, I was living in an apartment in Sydney. I was traveling to write it, and I have to say, I was listening to what people were telling me, but I was listening to it so that I could write the book and tell other people. I wasn't like ingesting the information properly. I wasn't acting on it. And then over time, it started seeping in a little bit. Like, we didn't have a car at first, and I was like, I think we should go buy a Jeep. And then I think we should put a rack on this Jeep. And then I think we should buy some fuel cans. I mean, you know how, how this goes. And so eventually we had an overland vehicle that was essentially a bug out vehicle. And then I bought some kayaks, and then I had a bug out plan for the water. And then my fiance and I, we left Australia to move to Ireland, actually. And we shipped all of our stuff. So we had, our Jeep, all of our furniture, our clothes, everything. We shipped it to Ireland to take up a new job at University College Dublin, and came back home for Christmas to Los Angeles, and then COVID happened. So I'm sitting here I've got a suitcase, right? I have no possessions. The place that we were renting in Sydney is gone. I'm back at my parents' house, and I'm looking at my proofs of this book, and I'm thinking, what, dude, you're an idiot. You weren't acting on it. You didn't go deep enough. So all of the stuff that we had sent got stuck at the Port of Dublin for like 2 years. And I'm teaching remotely in Ireland in the middle of the night. And then, like many people, the silver lining to the pandemic was that like we still had our salaries, we were working remotely, but we didn't have any bills. So we were just stuck at our parents' houses. And so we suddenly had a house deposit. And I was like, okay, well, this is kind of like, this is a sign, I've been thinking about this for years. Let's go buy a cabin in the woods. So we moved to Big Bear Lake and bought a cabin. And, then it got real. Then I cut out the ceiling and put in a ladder and started stockpiling supplies in the attic, and
in the attic.
In the attic, yeah. I actually I've got
up instead of down.
I did both. So I also put a sort of secret panel in the laundry room below the house that popped out, and then I had supplies underneath. We definitely rubbed off on you. Then is what you're saying. There's no doubt about it. Yeah, and what preppers told me as I was interviewing them for this book all the time was that it gave them a sense of peace. It gave them a kind of solace knowing that they might not necessarily need these things, but having them there allowed them to sort of move through life more confidently. Mm-hmm. Actually, to take more risks, because there's a kind of safety net there if things do go wrong. And I found that that's exactly what happened to me. I started feeling more confident about taking risks, and then eventually just resigned from academia altogether because I'm not saying that's because I started prepping, but it had something to do with it. Feeling more self-sufficient, more confident in my own abilities made me realize that actually I don't really need the paycheck from the university. I don't really need to be teaching those classes to feel like I'm fulfilling my goal in life, So I'm on a different path now for sure. And we've actually we kept the cabin, but we now moved on to a 5-acre ranch, and I'm really spreading out at this point. Yeah. And I've got this is the really cool part about the two properties. I actually figured out how to get a second property that is connected by a hiking trail. So the Pacific Crest Trail that goes from Canada to Mexico, I can actually walk that trail from one house to the other, which is like, the ultimate, bug out plan. Like, if all else fails, it's just bug out bag and take the trail to the other house.
I mean, the timing of doing all this research and how it culminated right in 2020 when the book was released is, fairly meaningful, it seems, in terms of like you could not have asked for to release a book at a better time. Maybe it could have been released a couple of years later, but Now 3 or 4 years has elapsed. Do you sense that since the time you wrote in the book, one of the data points was that there was 3.7 million preppers in North America? Do you think that number has changed a bit since that time?
It's completely changed. That number actually comes from my colleague, Dr. Chris Ellis at Cornell University. And he did this amazing research. So I do qualitative research. It's, soft and fuzzy. He does hardcore quantitative research.
Yeah.
And what he did is he collected, FEMA does this survey every couple of years, the National Household Survey. And one of the questions that they ask people in terms of emergency preparedness is, how long could you survive for 30 days on your own? So let's imagine power's off, taps aren't working.
How often do they
stores.
do this? Is like just a random sample. They call people up and.
Yeah, they do this every few years just to sort of like take the temperature. So it's part of it is that the U.S. government wants to know who's going to be able to take care of themselves and how much the government needs to invest in emergency services.
Right.
So that's why they do the survey. So before the pandemic, I think this is the 2017 National Household Survey, Dr. Ellis crunches the numbers and he finds that 3.9 million Americans said that they could survive for 30 days on their own. Post-pandemic, it's 14.9.
Wow. It's
almost 15 million people, which is wild. But the other thing is that they also ask people if they have purchased emergency supplies in the past 12 months, and almost half of Americans had after the pandemic. So, this is a radical change. And you're right. Like the book, I guess was eerily prescient in some ways, that I was writing this before the pandemic happened. But
before things started to fall apart.
Things were already falling apart.
Yeah.
But I think if you asked people in 2016, what do you think the likelihood is of a disaster that would strike the entire globe? I think most people would be pretty pessimistic about that, right? Now, if you ask people, they're like, well, yeah, it already happened, so imagining it happening again, whether it's a different scenario or another pandemic that's far worse, the fatality rate's a lot higher or whatever, people can now hold that in their heads, right? I mean, it's a similar thing with people who have lived through war. You ask older generations, like, could you imagine another world war? And they're like, well, of course, because
they
I lived through
understand
one,
human nature hasn't fundamentally changed since World War II or previous. We think it does, but I have this concept of generational exceptionalism where we think that because we've only seen feasts that famines don't exist. And it's very hard for you to conceptualize what you've never experienced. So now that people have a bit of a blueprint for that, they can extrapolate, okay, what happens if it's a little bit worse? What happens if the fatality rate's a little worse and the lockdowns are a little more strict? And, so it definitely gives us a point of reference. But one of my concerns is that I think a lot of people are already starting to become more complacent again. But at the same time, I think the time when you wrote this book, you had to be careful, right? Because
you don't want to overplay your hand.
Well, and writing a book like that, because it's it's often associated with a certain fringe element, which in some cases is well warranted. I like, there's a part in the book where you talk about an Aristotle quote where you say, if you're outside of society, you're either a beast or a god. And there's a certain, that you will never find that more prominent than in the preparedness community, where you have exceptionally intelligent people who are very capable, very resourceful, very influential, very, in some cases, notable public figures. And then on the flip side, you have some people who are a little unhinged. So it's like there's a fine line between insanity and genius almost. And that's no more obvious than in the preparedness community. But I think at the time when you wrote this book, you had to be careful in terms of the language and the approach, because it's written to an academic. You're trying to appease that, your colleagues when you're writing this book, right? Because many of them are not familiar with this culture, and they're probably very apprehensive about stepping into this world. But I think if you were to write the book now, you could be a lot more liberal with your analysis, in a sense that you don't have to. I found that there was a certain apprehensiveness to fully commit to the preparedness cause, and as an objective ethnographer, you have to be somewhat outside of the group to really truly understand them. You also have to assimilate, but you have to be you can't just join in and be a part of you have to be somewhat outside of it and report on it objectively. But I think it almost seemed like in certain parts of the book there was this indecisiveness. Like, you were, on the one hand, you really wanted to, like, you understood prepping and you were becoming this prepper, but you also, your skepticism, emerged for part of a chapter where you were, maybe talking about an experience you had that was unsettling, or you weren't too sure about this person. Can you explain maybe a bit about that process and maybe how that might be different today if you were to rewrite this book now?
Yeah, it's those are really good insights. So in terms of being objective, like I never make any pretense of being objective. If you're going to embed yourself in a culture, you're going to try and understand their worldview. You have to, on some level, imbibe. But yeah, I ran into people sometimes that their reasons, their motivations for prepping didn't make sense to me at all. So you could find someone who was like, I'm worried about the climate crisis, and I can see that there are more wildfires, or the weather's erratic, or there are more hurricanes, and that's why I'm putting my preparations in place. I'm like, okay, check. And then the next person I speak to is like, I think that there's a hidden planet that's going to emerge and create a magnetic pole shift. And I'm like, no, okay. I mean, but then their methodology is the same.
Probabilities, guys.
Right. Yeah. Their methodology is the same. But I think that the book, I am writing for multiple audiences. It's like, yes, I want my colleagues to read this book and say, this is a good piece of ethnographic research. I also want, anyone to be able to pick this book up at the airport or whatever and go, this is a fascinating story, and I'm learning something about a culture that I maybe didn't know about. And maybe it serves as inspiration to, to start prepping on even a low level, just build your bug out bag or try to get to 3 days or whatever. I hopefully that's what comes across in the book, but I also think that it did open some other doors for academics to be a little more pointed in their criticisms of the way everything's going.
This was definitely a gateway. Like, I think I understand how you had to write the book, because coming from academia, I know how they think. And as much as there's this openness to new things, there's also a certain closeness. And in order to be a gateway into something, you kind of have to straddle the fence. And you can't just be like, yeah, prepping is awesome.
It can't be polemic, yeah.
Yeah, it has to be, So in reading it a second time, that fully makes sense to me now. The strategy that you had to take here, and why the book is written in the way that it is. And I think that in writing it the way you did, you definitely are. It's hard when you're trying to play to so many audiences, like you're saying. Like you want this to get its mainstream due, but the only way to do that is if you kind of write it in a certain way, which is somewhat circumspect but you can definitely see throughout the process as you can see your progression becoming, your transformation, if you will, becoming more of a preparedness minded person yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the end of the book, I ended up going to Chernobyl and spending 4 days hiking to the exploded nuclear reactor, because I wanted desperately. Everyone kept talking about this post-apocalyptic world, right? Yeah. And I was like, I want to experience this. I want to know what exactly we're preparing for. And then it occurred to me, like, we have a post-apocalyptic world. It's Chernobyl, right? This is the worst nuclear disaster in human history. And so, going there and like camping in abandoned buildings and sneaking past the police and security guards and trying to make our way to Pripyat.
What year did you do that?
To the reactor. That was 2017.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, impossible to imagine now.
No,
right?
no, yeah. Now you'd be shot on sight. Probably.
Yeah, completely. I mean, early in the war in Ukraine, they took over Chernobyl. The Russians took it over, and I was like, my God, I had walked that landscape. I'd been there. It was surreal to imagine it as an occupied space.
How long can you stay there and be exposed to radiation? You had dosimeters. You had protective equipment.
Yeah, we had the dosimeter running all the time. There are certain objects, usually metal objects or things that have burned, that would really set it off. But we had a guide, and he knew what not to approach. But he would show us sometimes. He's like, "Watch, we'll go over to this fire engine here, and I'll show you. Watch the dosimeter go nuts. Stay away from that area." At one point, we actually we went into an old bunker. It was a missile launch facility, Soviet Union missile launch facility, derelict, and we go inside this thing, and there's a campfire smoldering in there, and he says, "Watch this," and he grabs the dosimeter again, goes over to the campfire, and it just went nuts. It was off the charts, and he says, "These idiots burned irradiated wood."
Oh wow!
And camped next to it, and we're breathing it all night. He's like, they're toast. Whoever did that. So but so again,
so
like
everything's irradiated, like especially the organics or the wood.
I mean, fruit was okay to eat. Wild animals were everywhere. You take humans out of the equation, and wildlife flourishes in ways that you couldn't believe.
Were they mutated, deformed?
No,
or
not at all. Not at all. I mean, there could be mutated animals out there we didn't encounter, but yeah, there were all sorts of animals. It was crazy. Wild boar and moose, and I don't know. It was like a nature park. So, when we think about the day after, like, what happens when you reemerge into the world after an event, what does that look like? It may look like a dangerous place for us, but it is a much more hospitable world in some ways for every other species on Earth.
Mm-hmm. So you have to become an animal, is what you're saying, in the apocalypse.
Yeah.
To survive.
Yeah.
So what other?
Which is something we should all be practicing. When people ask me like, how should I start prepping? I'm like, go camping. Mm-hmm. Start there. Just go out and be by yourself for a day and live out of a bag, and that puts you in the right mindset.
Start roughing it. Learn how to get accustomed to a little bit of struggle, a little bit of stress, a slight downgrade in the standard of living.
Completely. It's good for us to experience that. But most people live their lives exactly the opposite way. They try and avoid struggle, strife, inconvenience constantly. And that's part of the reason why we keep getting ourselves into these situations. I mean, that and the overcomplicated nature of modern civilization.
So you talk in the book, the first chapter is the dread merchants. Dread. Why this word dread, and what is the difference between dread, fear, and anxiety?
Oh my God, I spent so long trying to figure out this question. So the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote this extremely complicated, convoluted, but really fascinating book on dread. And I had to read this thing like 10 times to get the information into my brain. But essentially what he says is that dread is amorphous, that it doesn't have an object attached to it, right? So it's more difficult to sort of pinpoint. Whereas anxiety is about a thing, right? So it's like, I'm anxious about a thing that happened to me or a thing that I'm seeing, right? Whereas the dread is this sort of like background noise. And I, once I got my head around that, I found that to be really useful for thinking about the reasons that people prep. Some people, it's about an anxiety. It's about something that happened to them. right? They went through a traumatic experience, or, they lost their house to a bushfire or whatever. And that's why they're prepping, right?
Yeah.
Like, I have anxiety about this thing. And then other people are like, I don't know what I'm prepping for. I just feel really uneasy, right? And then I turned to Freud, where he's writing about fear, and I was trying to parse all that. Anyway, all of which is to say that the dread merchants in my book are the people that I met who are sort of selling you the solution, right? And it's in their interest to make sure that people are afraid, that they are full of dread, that they will stoke people's anxieties. They hit you on every level, because the more that you're the more that toxicity builds up, the more likely you are to write a check to them to buy a bunker, or to buy, a pallet of food buckets, or whatever it might be. And it kind of shocked me to realize that, we've got millions of people who are prepping in North America, and the narrative, the cultural narrative that we tell about prepping is actually not about those people. It's about the people selling those people things. You know what I mean? Like, the stories are about the bunker builders. It's about, the people selling bug out bags. It's about, this is how we sort of formulate it. But actually the people that I spoke to that were preparing themselves, they often I don't know, they didn't have that same level of fear, right? They were just trying to work through the practicalities of making themselves safer. But then the dread merchants would constantly come in and be like, oh no, but you should be scared, or like, don't think about selling your share in this bunker, because look at what just happened halfway across the world,
Do you think, though, that there's a distinction between a dread merchant and almost like a cult leader in a way? Because it seems like some of the people you were talking about in the book are people who, like you say, they I think anybody has, if you're in any industry, has a problem that it's trying to solve. And so, you have like the pharmaceutical industry, it's trying to solve the problem of medical ailments. You have the insurance agency that's trying to provide people with a economic solution to potential negative outcomes. And I think there's a line there where you're serving a pre-established need. So there is this dread that we know, that this existential dread, like, you're worried about the climate stuff, I'm worried about everything else, and that. And then so there's this demand, right? And then we get into this situation where, well, there's demand, there's legitimate demand, but then some of the demand, you're saying, can be fueled by the actual promotion of the supply. So is there not legitimate dread mercantilism, if you will? And perhaps, some of it gets into the realm of feeding into people's irrational fears, because they're, you talked about like the Planet X Nibiru stuff, and there's some people who are going to cater to that, right? Who are going to feed that. But then there's, I think, if I was wanting to buy a bunker, I would want to know that there were options. So I'd need, I'd want as many different bunker dealers as possible so I could have some competition in the market. But I would also, so I would want to know that the options were there, and I'd want to know that there's maybe a quality company, and that I could compare. But you're saying that you think that the majority of the companies out there are just stoking people's fears, or do you think there's some legitimate companies who are actually trying to build good quality products?
Oh no, there are tons of legitimate companies that are doing really good work. But capitalism is a disaster for the human psyche. Everything is turned into...
I see the communist cameraman sitting up now. He's like, I like this guy.
everything becomes an excuse to sell somebody something, and when what you're selling them is meant to alleviate existential anxiety, I think it does become really damaging to keep stoking this narrative, and the media is more guilty of this than anyone else, right? Like, in order to keep eyeballs glued to screens, they just keep telling us they're terrible out there. You have to keep watching if you want to know more about this. I mean, most recently, we've had this rash of looting in LA that's been pretty wild, kind of interesting. But, the media keeps banging on as if like things are getting so much worse. But when you look at the crime statistics, things are way better than they were in the 90s. So like the data doesn't match up with the narrative. Right. And I think that's the danger, is that you have someone selling a bunker, for instance, who's, they're giving you a narrative that doesn't actually marry up with reality.
So how would you, if you were to be a bunker dealer, how would you, and we just use that as the example, because I mean, really the bunker is one of those iconic things with prepping, but it's something that few preppers actually have. So it's kind of like the end. Okay, once you get to the level of you have a bunker, that's it. There really is no, nothing else to buy at that point.
Yeah, it's the terminal phase.
Yeah, exactly. So if you were a company in the preparedness industry, because we're in the preparedness industry too, we try to connect people with the right kind of products. How would you straddle that line of not being a self-fulfilling prophecy, but at the time meeting the demand?
So I think the first thing is to not tell people what they're scared of, right? Ask them, what is it you're worried about? And do I have something that could help you with that? And the second thing is, I think, giving people something that makes their lives better in the present and is useful in the future, right? So, I mean, prepping is speculation, right? You have to imagine something in the future to start preparing for it. This is why only human beings do this, because we can think about, if this happened, then, right? That whole thought connection is a deeply human thing. The problem is that when someone else starts making that connection for you, then you start getting scrambled.
Yeah, and see, this is where I think the cult guru aspect comes in.
Yeah.
Where you can have somebody who is stoking those irrational fears as opposed to somebody who is just meeting the demand, like you're saying. So I think that's a good way. Like, personally,
well, and I have to say, like, of all the bunker builders that I met, like, they are all alpha men with strong personalities, and there's a reason why, right? Because they're salespeople, and that is their business. They're gonna convince you that you have to think a certain way, and that's why you need their product.
But do you think, though, that that's kind of just par for the course? Like, as a customer of a person who wants to build a bunker, I mean, I'm kind of limited to what's out there on the market. So do you think that eventually the market, because this is a new industry too, relatively like a reborn industry, doom boom 2.0 as you call it, it's going to take some time to maybe for the best companies to rise to the top, and that right now, I mean, maybe that's just the nature of entrepreneurs, is that they're like that. And maybe there's going to be some, like, I know a guy who comes here often, Ron. He has a very similar philosophy in that he has his own conceptions of what the potential crises might be, but I don't think I've ever seen really shove that down people's throat as a reason to, like, I mean, there's even been examples where he's talked about the old lady who calls him up and is worried about this, that, and whatever, and he's like, yeah, you don't need a bunker, because like you just this is kind of nonsense, right? So I don't know, I think maybe that was my one hesitation about the book, was the characterization of the industry as tread merchants, which on the one hand I understand, but on the other hand it's kind of like, what other alternative is there? Like, especially this early in the game when we're trying to sort out, what's good and what isn't good, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I mean, these debates are had all the time about, what is the best methodology? Is it buying 5 acres and growing food? Is it building a bunker? Is it, stockpiling your garage? People are trying things out. And yeah, I mean, maybe it's unfair on some level that we've got emerging industries and they've all got their own reasons for existing. I mean, you wouldn't become a bunker builder if you if you didn't have your own concerns, right? And I'm sure we'll talk about the survival condo. I mean, he had a really interesting backstory. I do meet a lot of people that that worked for the government or they were in the military and they saw things that worried them, right?
Yeah.
And so they're trying to come up with a practical solution for their own anxieties. But in turning that into a business, it does feel to me often like they start pushing their anxieties on everyone else and then amplifying them unnecessarily. I mean, you go to the website for the Vivos group and it's like, super cinematic video of explosions and war and, starving people in the streets and, and they've got these sort of like news updates every time something terrible happens. It's like, oh, this is a great opportunity to sell you a bunker.
Yeah.
Come on, you don't need to do that.
Well, we'll talk about
the right customers are going to find you if you're making a good product.
We'll talk about the Vivos model because I think we need to have a conversation about like these communal bunkers in general, whether or not they're a good idea. And I don't, personally, I'm kind of like you. I don't view it as a very viable solution to just period. And I think there has to be some, like for myself personally, I started off because I'm concerned about the way things are going. And then I kind of told you my origin story of starting YouTube and then making a product, a new innovative product, and then it's slowly morphing into this business. But I think there has to be that initial impetus. But for a model that focuses on like a communal bunker, you do almost need a little bit more of conviction about a certain key event. Because that's to me, that seems like having your own personal bunker on your property, personally speaking, I think that's a more reasonable proposition. For starters, I think that having a bunker on your property serves a dual purpose. So you can use it for other things. You can use it as storage. You can use it as a safe room. You can use it as a panic room. You can use it as... it's just one of those things that's actually probably going to raise the value of your property. I mean, if you're going to look at a house and then, you're on the fence and they say, oh, we got one more thing to show you. Check this out.
Have you done the Zillow alert yet?
No.
Oh, it's super fun.
What's that?
Get on. Everyone should do this. Get on Zillow and put in the keywords, like save a search for a particular area. And then the keywords put bunker and you'll be amazed how many properties pop up on the market and they're like advertising there's a bunker in the backyard.
Right.
There are so many more bunkers than you think there are out there.
Like for me, that would be a selling point.
Totally.
Like, if I was on the fence and they took me down like to some secret lair, I'm like, man, holy shit. Like that would probably push. So I think there is a functionality for bunkers that is just, practical in nature. And then there's this idea that we do live in a consumerist society, and a lot of frivolous things there's a lot of frivolous pursuits outside the realm of just, preparedness that people waste money on. And so for me, it's like putting a little bit of insurance into preparedness, compared to how much you spend on like renovating your house or these other things like season tickets to the whatever sport of your choosing. It seems small by comparison. I think you talked about in your book 1% of a person's earnings. That was one guy's philosophy. You should be putting 1% of your earnings into preparedness.
Into security. Yeah,
security.
Generally.
Yeah.
And people interpret that in different ways. But, so a lot of people like to make a big deal out of these billionaire bunkers. You know, Mark Zuckerberg's building a bunker under his house, and it's like, well, yeah, because if you're 1% of his income is a lot of money. Of course, you're going to have an elaborate plan. Of course, you're going to have a security team. Of course, you're going to have a private plane. You know, if anyone invests, 1% of what they have into security, and most people probably do unintentionally, whether that's like a retirement plan or whatever, that's also security. Financial security is also security. So, yeah, I mean, it's not a crazy thing that they're investing that much money. The other thing though about the backyard bunker model, and I'm glad you brought this up, is that you can get to it. Because, this is a question that kept coming up for me. I was like, okay, so you bought space in a communal bunker in South Dakota and you live in Florida.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, there might be some situations like at the beginning of COVID. I know all of the preppers that had space at X Point in South Dakota. Yeah, they all jumped in their cars and RVs and they slowly made their way there. It wasn't that kind of disaster, right?
No.
But if you've got, if you have a Hawaii,
30 minutes
you have a
to
Hawaii
bombs.
situation, yeah, where you get the text message on your phone saying there's an incoming ballistic missile. Good luck getting to your bunker,
Well, on the one hand, it's more of an evolved, like it's an evolution away from the lone wolf, right? Because you're admitting that, okay, I need a community to survive.
Yeah. And everything is easier as a group.
But there's like, I'm wondering what kind of person, the difference between the kind of person that goes for that versus has their own bunker in their backyard. Like, is there something inherent in their personality that says, I want to go and bunk up with a bunch of people I don't know and put a bunch of money in this guy's, fantasy bunker that he's built? Like, to me, there's a naivete that must accompany that, to be able to be willing to put your eggs in that basket. Number one, how do you know they're going to open the doors for you when the time comes? I mean, if there's an event that is so catastrophic that, the world is ending and you got to go into this bunker, how do you know they're going to let you in?
Yeah.
I mean, all the legal stuff, I mean, does that even matter at that point?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you really have to trust the person that's building these bunkers.
You do. And so, I'll come back to my point here. Part of the problem is that the person who's selling those bunkers, the dread merchant, as I call them, they're letting anyone in. Anyone who writes a check is getting space in there, right?
Mm-hmm. So you don't know who's
so
in
you're going to
there.
love this communist utopia. So if you had a self-selecting community where you were choosing your neighbors, right, and you're building the community together, then I think you've got a better chance at social cohesion. Because when the bunker builder is just letting anyone in who writes a check, like, you have no idea who your neighbor is, or if they're insane, or if they're going to let you into the community when you get there or whatever. But the other thing that I always think about is, like, often these places have a security team, right? And it's like, what would motivate your security team to stay in an event? Because that's part of what they're selling, right? Is you buy space in the bunker, and then we've got this gated community, and then we've got our security guard posted outside who's going to keep everyone safe inside. And it's like, well, first of all, you probably should offer them space in the community,
right?
But then they're not paying, so other people are going to be pissed off. They're like, hey, why did I pay $45,000 for my bunker and you just give it to Frank because he's the guard? But then it's like, okay, so you give him space, or her, but then what about their family?
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to tell them, okay, you're the guard, and then in a catastrophic event, we definitely need you here, and you've got space in the bunker, but your family can't come. You know what I mean? These things start to get really complicated in a community structure, in a communal
What's
structure.
to stop the guard from saying, well, I'm the one with all the guns, and I know all the layout of this place, and if I want, I can trap you down there. I can do whatever, like, what's to stop? And so this is why I think you're right. With the dread mercantilism, you almost have to sell. This is where you almost have to sell yourself, right? As opposed to, like, the independent bunker builders, I would say they're catering it for my needs. I can go on Atlas Survival and I can pick which bunker I want. they'll do the whole thing. If they want, they can do it at night. They can, sign a non-disclosure agreement and all this stuff, and they can do it in secret. But really, with these communal bunkers, you're buying the person in a way. You're buying, they're taking that person on their word in a lot of ways. So, to me, it's a leap of faith to be putting your eggs in that basket. This is why did you notice, did you meet any of these people who are buying shares in these bunkers?
Oh yeah. I spent a lot of time with people.
And so was there anything that you found about them that was a defining feature of their personality per se that might have been different from the
it depended on the facility, to be honest. You've got the high end is survival condo, where you've got people paying $1.5 million for a half floor, or $3 million for a full floor. That's a particular kind of person who has that disposable income.
Right.
Then you've got a place like the X Point, where people are spending $45,000-$45,000. You find a lot of people who are middle class moving into that community who just decided, instead of, they have a little bit of disposable income, and instead of buying a boat or an RV, during your midlife crisis, you buy the bunker. And then places like Fortitude Ranch, where people are buying in, it's almost like a timeshare, they're paying into it yearly so that they can retreat to it, but it's basically a farm, but it's just a kind of promise that yes, you can come here if something happens.
Yeah.
So, totally different business models, all of these things, but, similar people moving into all of them, I would say, in terms of their concerns about what may be unfolding in the future.
See, to me, maybe I'll get you to talk a little bit more about, what is the very lavish one that you were talking about?
Survival condo.
So for me, if I was that rich, why wouldn't I just build my own thing? Why would I? And I'm not saying that all rich people have high IQs, but I don't think you get that wealthy being stupid. So
because what they're buying is it's a time saver, right? They've got a security consultant telling them you need to invest 1% of your income in your security. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. And so they bought a package.
If you're watching, think through it a little bit more.
Yeah. So they bought a package, right? It's you get your space in your bunker. They've got a security team. They've got an evacuation plan on some of their packages. So they'll actually come get you and get you. And,
the whole 9 yards.
They'll come get you to the bunker. So that, that's what they're buying. Is the the one size fits all solution to the apocalypse. But it's so weird when I would talk to people, they would think about getting to the bunker, but they didn't think much about what life would be like in the bunker. Mm-hmm. And often they didn't know who else had space in it. Right. Often there were these non-disclosure agreements, so you don't know who has space in it, right?
So you're going to get there, for all you know, there's some person who's been convicted of God knows what, or maybe they're just an asshole, or maybe they're the best people, maybe they're the salt of the earth, but you never know.
But you don't know, right? And this is the whole game, is we're trying to come to grips, we're trying to take what we don't know, which is this dread we're experiencing, and we're trying to make it something known. Right. That's fundamental to prepping, right? It's let's ring fence this and try and think about what might happen.
Yeah.
Right. And put our preparations in place. But fundamentally, these people have not thought about what life would be like in the bunker. And then really amazingly, they almost never talk about what happens when they emerge from the bunker,
Yes.
So that's totally the realm of fantasy.
I think you call that the 15th day. The problem of the 15th day.
The problem of the 15th day, yeah. Right. And that comes from nuclear strategists who were saying you got to be in the bunker for 14 days for the radiation levels. Yeah. So the problem of the 15th day is you open the bunker and then it's like scorched earth out there. And what are you going to do now? Mm-hmm. And what I found when I pressed people on that, then we start getting into these really weird fantasyland things where they're like, well, 80% of the population's going to be gone. And so I'll just go claim the Philippines or what, and I'm like, really?
Scoop,
and do what? You know, I mean, fundamentally the question here is like, what's the point of making it through, you know? So like, I talked about the bunker as a temporal space. It's like, it's a bridge, right? Or it's, one of the bunker builders described it to me as a ship in the earth, but instead of traveling through space as a ship does, it travels through time, right? So you get into this bunker, it acts as a bridge, and then you emerge into the post-apocalyptic world. But then what? Like, almost no one had an answer to that question that was satisfying to me. I was like continually frustrated.
Maybe
that through.
Before we talk about that, in your book, Bunker, that you should definitely buy because it's a great book, or just get the Audible version. I like the Audible version. It's narrated by a great narrator. Yeah,
Adam Sims. He's an awesome narrator. I was very lucky to get him.
Yeah, and you talk about your experiences in these different bunkers around the world. So the one that you were just talking about, I just already forgot what the name of it was.
Survival Condo.
Survival Condo. That is one of the most elaborate ones. Can you tell us a bit about that particular bunker? And like, I know you go into it in detail in the book, but maybe just for some of our listeners, because I think that was, would you say that's the most lavish one that you've seen on a private bunker level, or were there other ones that were?
It's the most lavish private bunker in the world, hands down. Okay. I'm sure there are government facilities that are more elaborate, but it was absolutely mind-blowing. And I have to say, it took me like a year to get into this. I mean, I just kept hammering Larry Hall, the guy that owns it. I was like, please,
Yeah, how did you get in there in the first place?
Oh, I kept sending him messages, and and then I would drop in like, hey, I went to X Point, I went to Fortitude Ranch, I met Ron at Atlas. I went, you know what I mean? Yeah. I kept, and I was like,
Canadian prepper.
Well, that's
Larry, I'm coming for you. He won't let me in there. I doubt it.
He might.
Maybe he will. We'll see. Yeah.
What would be cool is we could go there together.
Okay.
And then we can take a film crew, and then we can do a whole. I mean, that'd be fun.
Let's do it.
It'd be fun to interview Larry in the bunker.
Yeah.
In any case, so I finally get the invitation, and I was in Texas or something, and he's like, yeah, if you can get here in 6 hours, I'll let you in. And so I'm just like pedal to the metal, I'm like flying up the interstate. But I get to this thing, and it's in the middle of a bunch of cornfields in Kansas, and it's just this sort of, there's like a mound of grass with a pillbox on top of it, and then a gate around it, and a guard there with a machine gun. I'm like, okay, I found it. Yeah. And yeah, I went like, the only way I can describe this is if you imagine a skyscraper that's 15 stories high, and then imagine that inverted, and it's underground, right? So I call it a geoscraper in my book. But it was an Atlas F missile silo that had a nuclear tipped ICBM in it. And obviously after the Cold War, they took the nukes out, and these things are like all over the American Midwest. And so Larry Hall purchased one of these bunkers from the government for $300,000 with the land at the surface as well.
It's cheap.
Yeah, it's really cheap. Considering that, I mean, the cost to the taxpayer to build this thing in, 1964 or whatever would have been astronomical. So he tells me that he buys this bunker. It's full of water. They spend ages like pumping like agricultural runoff,
Okay.
They spend ages pumping water out of this thing. And then he starts building, and it's essentially, it's a silo, so it's round. And he's got living space in there for about 60 people. Oh. He's got 3 power systems in there. So they've got a giant wind turbine outside, solar panels, and then
like a vertical. Is it a vertical wind turbine or like a windmill type one?
Yeah, a windmill.
Okay, because they have some that are that way.
Yeah. It's a turbine like you'd see in Palm Springs.
Okay.
And so then he's got diesel backup generators and 5 years of fuel in there, and he's got this Tesla battery wall that's getting juiced up all the time. I mean, so he's got energy covered. He's also got like a volcanic ash scrubber in there because he was particularly concerned about the Yellowstone caldera blowing. But then, so there's all the practical stuff that you'd expect. You know, there's like an actual grocery store with
Is there
number 10 cans. It's got the coffee machine for the barista. You can bake bread in there. It like looks like a little Whole Foods or something. Shopping carts and everything. You can like literally go shopping.
On the topic of energy, is there any geothermal aspects in there?
Yeah. So they had drilled a bunch of wells, and they were pumping water into the bunker from those wells. And I think he said that there was geothermal potential there too.
Okay.
So that could be a fourth. I mean, you know, redundancy is everything, right? So he's always thinking like, how can I add another layer of redundancy?
Yeah, because that could be for climate and for power, electricity. You can use it for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's grocery store.
So he's got the grocery store, yeah, and then there's like a tunnel from the grocery store to the aquaponics facility, and so they've got tilapia in there, and the tilapia are you know, feeding lettuce, and so it's they tried to create sort of a closed system, and he hired all these experts, you know, to come in and tell him like how to build this thing to function as like a self-sufficient machine, right? I mean, this is like Le Corbusier's dream, you know, a machine for living. It's like a perfectly enclosed situation.
But are they growing other vegetables or just like the leafy greens?
Yeah, they were just leafy greens when I was there. But, you know, he said... So the other interesting thing is he hired a psychologist to come into the bunker and basically like tell him what would cause people to crack, you know? And that was one of the things she said was like, you need to have fresh vegetables. If people are just eating this canned food, they're not going to last long. Like you might have 5 years of food, but people do not want to eat it for 5 years, you know?
Yeah. And
equally, you need windows in here because if people feel like they're in a bunker, they're going to go nuts. So he had installed these 4K screens that were like vertically installed, and they had a piped in camera feed from the outside. So when you're in your apartment, it like you can see, you know, the trees blowing in the wind out there, and
so it's in real time. So you get the sense that it's actually what's going on.
Well, yeah, I mean, he tells you it's in real time. I mean, I did have this thought that it could be scorched earth out there, and he could just be like,
put it on a loop.
Put it on a loop. Like, don't
make for an interesting movie.
Yeah, I know. But the psychologist like went through everything: height of the ceilings, color of the paint, you know, and then most importantly, keeping people distracted. Right. So they had a shooting range in there, a rock climbing wall, a dog park. So people are going to bring their pets, so they're going to go nuts. They had a cinema, like a full cinema in there, and they had a giant hard drive with like every movie you could imagine preloaded, so they're not streaming anything, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no internet. There was an education center. I mean, it just went on, and I couldn't, like, every time we would go...
What was the square... Is there like a square footage on this place?
It's a good question.
The way you're describing it.
I know it's 200 feet deep. And then you can kind of imagine like there's 15 levels. I don't know the square footage, but you know, the apartments were like comfortable. Like it's like you're staying in a Hilton or whatever, you know.
It sounds like the Fallout game, like the one that we were just talking about earlier, where you know you dig down and you build different levels, and you have your electrical and your leisure, and you have your room where people go to breed, and then you have your, you know, I'm sure they don't have that, but they have, so some of the floors are like you can own a whole floor, or do you share floors with people? Yeah.
So a half floor is $1.5 million. The full floor is $3 million. One person bought 2 floors and made a 2-story thing. I think he told me that woman was from New York, and she also asked Larry to hire someone to film New York from the window of her penthouse apartment over 4 seasons so that could be piped into the windows.
Wow.
So she would actually see the changing of the seasons, like, you know, potentially in a nuclear waste. There's a nuclear wasteland outside, and she's just like hearing the car horns, and civilization goes on as normal. So like completely living inside a simulation.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is there a medical bay, I presume?
Medical bay, 3 armories, a jail. Yeah. He really had thought through everything.
It's like a mini society.
Yeah. And then, so of course I asked him, what motivated you to build this?
Yeah.
And he said that he was doing work for the Department of Defense, for the U.S. Department of Defense, and he was building bunkers for them. And when he realized what they were building them for, he knew what he was doing when he left. So he invested, he raised $10 million to build this thing.
Wait a minute. He knew what they were building them for?
Yeah.
Like as in their...
But he wouldn't tell me. I mean, this could have been part of his sales pitch. Yeah. But that's what he said, that he found out why they were building these bunkers, and he knew that when he left, he wanted to build his own.
Like, to me, this sounds like, because if we're talking nuclear disaster, we're talking about 14 days. So it almost sounds like, meteor, asteroid strike, Yellowstone, something more permanent.
Yes.
That he would be preparing for.
Well, the volcanic ash scrubber is probably a clue.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I mean, that's a pretty specific piece of equipment to spend $300,000 on to put in your bunker, I
mean, I'm sure it's dual purpose also for
air filtration generally.
Air filtration.
Yeah.
But
the medical bay also had a separate air intake. So like if someone was infected, they could not infect the rest of the bunker, which was, another thing that I just wouldn't have thought of.
Wow.
He put a lot into this. So $10 million he dumps into building this thing, and then he all the space in the bunker sold in like a year after it was built.
Wow.
And he made 20 million, and then he took 10 and bought another silo.
And so he's doing the same thing.
He's building another one, and I saw that one like 3/4 of the way done. Mm-hmm. And he told me that he was going to be networking those together via Ethernet cables, so there would be communication between the silos.
Wow.
And I have a feeling that this will keep going. Like he's going to keep buying these things across Kansas or the American Midwest and networking them together and creating essentially a subterranean society.
Wow. And I mean,
of only rich people.
Right.
Which is pretty dystopian.
So people must, confide in him then that he's going to honor his word and let them in when the time comes. I presume.
You got to take that on faith.
Yeah.
I mean, the other problem is that he's the one that told me. I said, you're going to need people in here with particular skill sets, right? Yeah. And he said, "Oh, Brad, when someone's writing you a check for $3 million, you don't ask them what kind of skills they have, Right. But it just seems to me that like that's the kind of situation where you get people dying from tooth infections, or trying to like fix an electrical thing and shocking themselves to death, or terrible things are going to happen in that bunker because you don't have all of the people that maintain your life now on an everyday basis aren't in there, right?
I'm sure you're going to get a couple surgeons, but you're hoping you will.
Yeah, but so that's why I say in terms of the communal model, I don't think that works as well as people imagine it's going to, but you really need the way that would work really well is to say, okay, we've got 60 people. What are the absolute crucial skills that those 60 people need to have to keep this ship floating, right? To use the Earth ship metaphor. And then if you're lacking, so you could select people that have particular skills. You're like, let's get a doctor, let's get a dentist, let's get an electrician, let's get a plumber, let's get, you start selecting all these people. And then whatever skills you find you're lacking, people start training now. Like that's real prepping, right?
And you would think that the rich people who are buying stock in there would almost want that. They would almost want that human resource component. Yeah. Because a plumber is never going to be able to afford it. I mean, it's still lucrative income by today's standards, but not enough to afford a place in there. So you'd almost need to make provisions for people who were not, who didn't have the means to buy a place in there, but you're going to need to rebuild.
I think this is the fundamental flaw in the plan. Mm-hmm. I mean, aside from the fact that, you
have to get there.
You have to get there. And then when that door closes, who's in control of the situation? I mean, that's also not mapped out very well.
Right.
And you've got a bunch of people, you've got a bunch of millionaires, 60 of them in a bunker together, who all think they're the most important person in the world, probably, right? I mean, it's just like every possible chance for confrontation and friction is there. You've got every ingredient.
Yeah.
It seems like it would be a very difficult thing. And then the clincher here to me is that you put them in the bunker, they're looking at the windows, that they don't know whether this is a live feed or a recycled loop, and then you're telling them, I'm not sure when we're going to leave.
Mm-hmm. In fact, I think this is the basis for a movie about, wasn't that Blast from the Past, where with Brendan Fraser, where they thought that the world ended and they stayed in a bunker for 25 years.
Right, and then he came out of the bunker and like didn't understand how anything worked.
Yeah. So it's something like that where I could see, I could see that happening, where your world is being manipulated, your reality. I'm sure there's some Plato cave metaphor in there somewhere.
Completely.
Yeah, it's fascinating, though, to know that people are going to that extent. I'm sure for a lot of people, it's just a backup plan. I'm sure people who have the means to do that probably have their own bunkers at home. But if, worse comes to worse. Are you familiar with Josh Harris's We Live in Public documentary? I would encourage you to look into that, because at the turn of the millennium, I think it was right before the dot-com bubble, Josh Harris was a very prescient tech bubble guy who, went during like pre-2000, during the tech boom. He was one of the first people to promote live streaming. And I mean, this is back in 2000, the internet could barely handle a live stream.
Yeah.
But he was the first guy to kind of live stream his life, first guy to do like a lot of video conference stuff. And I think he had a lot of businesses that boomed and then they went bust when the tech bubble popped. But he had this experiment where he got everybody to go and live in this bunker for 2 weeks. He said, you can come down here, you can party, but the thing is that there's cameras everywhere. So it was a social experiment. So there was all of these cameras, like cameras in the bed, cameras in the washroom, cameras there was no privacy, because he predicted that in the future, and rightly so, and this is why it's so prescient, that there would be no privacy in the future, that everything would be, that's why they call it We Live in Public, right? So he wanted to do this social experiment. What would happen if you had this total full-blown panoptical situation where everything was monitored? And I think at the 2-week period, everybody started like losing it. People were, it probably didn't help that he had a gun range down there. And, but it was just this debaucherous, crazy scene where, just orgies and just like all manner of, chaos was unfolding. And I think the police eventually broke it up because they thought it was some sort of millennium doomsday cult.
Oh my God.
Yeah. There's a whole documentary on this.
Oh, this sounds amazing.
It's right up your alley. Yeah, I'd encourage you to check it out and see how it maps onto your other findings about human nature, because this is one of those situations where you pull a bunch of young people together and you say, you can do whatever you want, everything's free, but, we get to keep all the footage. And so that's what he did. And it turned out to be quite the disaster.
Yeah, well, remember the biosphere experiment from the 70s where they took a bunch of scientists, highly educated, highly capable people, and they said, you're going to live in this bubble for a year. I think it was like, they were trying to simulate extraterrestrial colonization, like if we build like
a Mars base,
or a moon base or whatever, and we have to live inside this hermetically sealed system, right? And like everyone's got to do their jobs and grow food and whatever. And of course, it descended into chaos, and people were sleeping with people they shouldn't have been, and they had social friction, and then people started starving and stealing food, and then eventually someone broke the seal on the thing because they weren't getting enough oxygen. Like it was sabotaged.
How long did the experiment last?
The experiment was sabotaged by the scientists who designed the experiment.
He couldn't handle it.
They couldn't handle it, yeah. But most of the problems were social, and not technical. Like they were technically capable of dealing with this.
So there wasn't an oxygen issue. It was like a hallucination, or
there was an oxygen issue, but instead of sort of
fixing it.
persevering, and fixing it. So I think someone was kicked out of the bubble, and so they came back and sabotaged the seal to like ruin the experiment or something. I don't know. There's so much social friction, but that's why Larry had hired the psychologist to come in to say like, how can we minimize this? Because that anyone can build a bunker that is going to function as a hermetically sealed space, more or less. I mean, you have to have air come into it, and water and other resources. But the question is like how long does it take for people to start cracking internally or to start lashing out externally against other people? That is your primary problem. And that's the problem that we're going to have with moving underground generally, or colonizing the moon or Mars or whatever we imagine doing. It's going to be problems amongst people, which is how we got into this situation where the world is falling apart.
Exactly.
To begin with.
Did your research take you in the direction of submarines and the conditions in which, the psychology of how they designed those? Did you look into that at all in terms of how these bunkers are designed? I
did, yeah. And the primary conclusion that I took away from all those studies is that the only way they function is through a completely authoritarian structure. One person in charge, they tell everyone what to do, everyone has a job, they do their jobs. And also you rotate those jobs, so that people aren't getting bored.
Right. That's one thing you said in the book is people were given jobs, so they have to create some normalcy.
Well, yeah, because if you stick people in this bunker and then they're just like watching TV all day, they're going to start getting really antsy, So you have to tell people, hey, you're in charge of whatever, maintaining the Tesla battery wall or whatever,
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what they do in a submarine. It's like everyone has a specific job, and there's one person in charge, and there's absolutely no. I mean, a ship's the same way. Like imagine these Age of Discovery voyages. Like that's why you had the cat o' nine tails, right? Because you can't have a mutiny. That'll sink the ship. So it's a bunker's the same way. It's just
it's a very undemocratic situation.
It's the only way to make it work, which is another flaw in the plan.
See, it seems like for preppers who are wanting freedom from that, and they're fantasizing about this anarchy world, as we were talking about earlier, trying to hide from that, to go from this to a totalitarian underworld would be not the direction that maybe most people really want to go. But
well, I think that's why you see a lot of people working on the kind of like the farm model,
Right.
Forget about the bunker.
Above ground.
Yeah,
preppers.
We're buying space, we're growing food, we're going to have a nice community. I do think that that's a more functional model, at least in terms of social systems and people's psychology. I think it's quite important that people breathe air and they're outside, but it depends on what you're preparing for. If nuclear war is the thing that you're worried about, that's not going to be a good situation on an open air farm. So
what do you, in terms of the government facilities, what is the most elaborate government facility you've seen? Underground facility.
I've never been into a live facility for obvious reasons. I've been into a couple of derelict bunkers. The most. So let me first say that my friend Garrett Graff wrote this incredible book about Raven Rock, which is one of the most. I read it. Yeah, one of the most elaborate government bunkers in the U.S. And
called "How the Government Planned to Save Themselves While the Rest of Us Died."
That's right. Yeah. Awesome subtitle.
Yeah.
But that's an amazing book if you want to learn about how these government bunkers are built and how they function. I mean, he writes at one point that it's a multi-story structure inside a mountain, essentially, on giant springs, so that it can take the shock of impact. Like if it's hit directly with the nuke, this whole building will flex underground, which is just like mind blowing.
Yeah.
But I went into when I was living in the UK working on my PhD, there was a bunker there called Burlington. It had a whole bunch of code names, but it's under a Royal Air Force base in Wiltshire, and I was hanging out with the urban explorers, and we sort of, you know, got a lead. Someone was like, hey, you can get into Burlington right now. We're like, oh, really? So we jumped in a car and drove down there and went through this quarry underground. And then, I mean, we were walking for, it felt like hours, and then eventually came to a red blast door. And the door had like a little bit of wiggle room. It, like you could almost get it open. So we had a couple of people yank on this thing, and then one guy got his hand behind it, and there was like, you know, like a big wing nut on the back, and he spun that thing and blast door opened. And then we go inside, and there was like a row of electric buggies, and we found a screwdriver and hot wired the buggies. I don't know. It's amazing that all of this like came together in the way it did. But the buggies were because there was an underground city inside this, behind this blast door. There were 60 miles of tunnels.
This is
there.
Under London?
No, it's about an hour outside of London. So this is the bunker where they would have taken the Queen and, you know, the royalty, the Prime Minister, like everyone would have been evacuated to this bunker. I'm not sure how you get from London to Wiltshire in, you know, if there's like a nuclear strike, you're not going to make it in time. But
yeah, you getting there by helicopter, I presume.
Probably, yeah. But so there was space down there for 3,000 people. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we drove the buggies around, and we're just opening door after door. And it's like there was one room that was just full of like rotary telephones with the Queen's seal wrapped in plastic stacked to the ceilings, like hundreds of them.
Wow.
There was
this stuff is just down there. Like
it's just down there.
Relics.
Yeah. It's Cold War relics.
And so you're not allowed to be in this place.
No, not at all. And we
so this is someplace they might still use.
No.
You don't think so?
I'll get to that.
Okay, all right.
So we're all down there with we've all got high-end cameras, and we're photographing everything, right? We find the kitchens, we find BBC broadcasting facilities, like a full radio broadcasting station underground. We're like 100 feet underground. There was a giant reservoir, drinking water, everything that you might imagine in a government bunker. But the coolest thing down there was a library. And in the library was every book, map, and document that you would need to reconstruct the UK government after a total nuclear attack, right? Like everything's been wiped out. Here's the handbook, basically, for how you rebuild civilization. It's this library. Really cool to dig through those books.
Is there like weapons and stuff down there too?
No weapon. We didn't find any weapons down there.
I'm sure they would maybe make that a little bit more inaccessible. Did you have like full access to the entire place?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And 60 miles of it?
60 miles of tunnels. Yeah. I mean, we didn't even scratch the surface. We were down there for like 10 hours driving these buggies around.
So for all you know, there was something down there that you didn't see that was
could have been.
Right.
So we get back from this exploration. Like we went past a bunch of cameras down there. No one responded. Incredible that we get away with this, right?
Well, that's the government.
And I know.
Right? This goes to show they can't even keep their own facilities.
Secrets. Yeah, they can't keep their secret city a secret.
Oh man.
So of course we get home.
We're screwed.
We get home and we just like start plastering the internet with all of these photos of the bunker, right? And I don't know if this is a direct consequence of us making it public, but a couple of years later, the government announced that the bunker was for sale.
Oh.
So I forgot what they were going to sell it for. It's like, I don't know.
Has it sold yet?
£3 million or something. Well, this is how I met Robert Vicino, because he was one of the potential buyers. And he had this whole vision that he was going to buy the bunker from the UK government and then create a bunch of, it's like sell bedrooms essentially inside the bunker to preppers that wanted to buy space in his subterranean community. He didn't end up buying it, and I think they ended up selling it to someone that turned it into a data storage facility or something. That often happens with bunkers, that they're turned into data storage. It used to be that companies like Iron Mountain, I've broken into a few of their facilities as well. Iron Mountain used to store, they would buy these bunkers and then put like actual files down there. I've gone into a couple of their facilities and been like digging through all of these files that like, because corporations are meant to keep them for a certain amount of time. So they get a contract with Iron Mountain, and Iron Mountain stuffs them in an old Cold War bunker. But
Is
now,
that important?
I guess. I think it's a legal requirement, that you have to keep them for a certain amount of time. But obviously they don't want them like in their office. So there were a lot of, legal documents and corporate manuals and stuff like that. But now what you see is a lot of, data. Like people are just putting up giant server rooms because it's a constant temperature underground, right? You don't have any exposure to the elements. It's easy to keep them. You can run cooling fans down there. It's easy to keep them cool. And also it's hard for people to get into it. So,
and if something were to happen, they would still have the data on people.
See, this is just like the caveman, right? Caching their stuff in there and then blocking it up. That we're still doing the same thing thousands of years later.
What do you think in terms of, like, what do you think they have out there now? Because we know that these bunkers are declassified. So if they're not using that bunker anymore, do you think that they're on the ball enough to have built other ones? Or do you think that maybe they've just gotten complacent and are hoping the Russians don't destroy them?
The threat of mutually assured destruction was a pretty strong motivator to invest all these resources. I don't think that we're building at the pace that we were, but new bunkers are being built all the time. I mean, Israel just built this phenomenal underground facility that Netanyahu is like taking press conferences down there to show off this new thing.
Wow.
But to your point, if we know about those things, what do we not know about? Right. I found a New York Times article from 2001 that estimated that there were 20,000 underground facilities in the world in 2001. Right. So it's kind of mind-boggling to imagine how much stuff is buried in the crust of the earth that we know nothing about.
These are big facilities, not just bunkers.
These are huge facilities,
Right.
Underground cities, weapons factories. North Korea has hollowed out an entire mountains full of Russian MiG fighters that are like old MiG fighters from the 80s, but they're like poised on a runway and they can open the mountain up and they all emerge from it. It's like Battlestar Galactica.
So these North Korean, maybe you could talk a little bit about what you know about their subterranean preparations, because obviously it's shrouded in secrecy, but I've always suspected with an isolated country like that, the only place to go is down.
Absolutely. I spoke to an expert on North Korea, and he was telling me that essentially the North Korea is underground, like the whole country is underground. What we see on the surface, what we see in satellite images is not what exists. That they've been tunneling and burrowing underground. We know that China's been producing a lot of tunnel boring machines. I'm sure those TBMs are ending up in North Korea, and they're using them to punch through mountains and build all sorts of stuff. So
TBMs.
Oh, tunnel boring machines. Yeah. So this is what I'm going to be working on next. But it's hard to imagine what's there is the point. But I imagine that part of the reason that I'm talking about, Western countries in general, sort of hold back on any sort of military intervention in North Korea is because we don't know what's underground. And it's pretty clear that he's willing to starve his people to build anything out there. So, he could be investing vast resources into building subterranean military bases that would be extremely difficult to deal with.
Even in the case of a nuclear conflict, looking at Gaza as an example, you have the best weapons, the best intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It's a place which is cut off from the world. It is surrounded on all sides. It's a very small landmass. And even that is taking months and months and hundreds of thousands of troops and tens of thousands of very expensive weapons. And it's costing billions and billions of dollars. To think that you could scale that up in a way which was sustainable to fight a war like that, even if you were to use nukes, because you're saying a lot of these places are impenetrable to nuclear weapons.
Well, I mean, if you could even figure out where to drop the nuke, right? I mean, the U.S. government is now working on essentially ground penetrating radar that can be used from space.
Right.
And at some point we will have the ability to see underground, which, there goes our last sanctuary.
I was going to say that we're trying to escape, and SpaceX and Elon are working on ways to find us underground even.
Completely. But yeah, you're right. I mean, Gaza's just been such a nightmare because of these tunnel systems. And I mean, under one hospital, they found like a 3-story tunnel system. These things were all built by hand, which is, again, just sort of mind-boggling. But imagine a country that has access to far more resources, including tunnel boring machines. And, what are they digging under there? We have no idea.
Do you think
they could all be happening in secret? Like, we don't have any kind of sensor arrays that would be able to figure out that this is happening.
Do you think there's a deterrent component to this then, where I think in part of your book you had said that, and partly, I'm not sure if I disagree with it or not, but I think it's a subject of debate in terms of bunkers might embolden people to push the button even more. But based on what you're saying, it almost sounds like if we know that it's futile to take out the enemies in that way, like if we know we're never going to be able to kill them even with nuclear weapons, is that potentially what's preventing nuclear conflict?
I think so. I think it's another chess piece in the mutually assured destruction plot, right? It's like if you have nukes and you have bunkers that can resist nukes, it does make it kind of futile to enter into conflict. I mean, that scale of conflict. Maybe that's an argument for governments being more transparent about the secret facilities that they're building. Just saying, look, this is. I mean, I'm sure all of this happens. Things get leaked, right? Yeah. And it's totally intentional. And they're just like, oh yeah. I mean, the whole Russian nukes that just got launched into space. Yeah. We were discussing earlier whether that was intentionally leaked or not, that information. But that's the game. That's the geopolitical game.
So what do you know about?
What's interesting now, though, is that we've got private players in the geopolitical game. That has never happened before in history. That we've got private people building bunkers that could also withstand like military conflict. That has never happened before.
Do you think, and maybe you'll discover more in your investigations with tunnel boring machines, TBMs, do you think that these machines are in the possession of private companies that can do things like this?
Yeah, Elon bought a tunnel boring machine. He bought a used tunnel boring machine, and he dug a hole without permission under LAX or in Hawthorne at the SpaceX facility.
Wow. You're allowed to do that?
No.
Did he get fined, or did he?
The city came out eventually and were like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah.
And he said, "I was really frustrated with the traffic going from SpaceX to LAX, and I have this amazing idea, that we can dig a tunnel, and I think his idea is only Teslas will be able to access the tunnel. They're supposed to sort of pull onto these like skates, that will take them from port A to port B. But essentially, after he had started digging this thing without permission, and then they looked at it, they were like, well, that's a great idea. How much do you want?
Yeah.
And now he's got all these contracts. He did one in Vegas, and now he's getting contracts all over the world to start building these things. So,
well, his whole idea is 3-dimensional travel underground and just building this network of tunnels.
Yeah, it's called the metro system, but
right,
the difference. The difference is public versus private. And so, to my point, if we have all of these private actors now that have the resources and the means to dig tunnels and build bunkers, the underground becomes a new sort of like battleground for space, we're sort of running out of space on the surface of Earth. We've built buildings about as high as we can. I think the Burj Khalifa is probably the pinnacle of how high we can go in terms of building up, but it's limitless how far down we could go. I mean, we've only gone into, I think, 2% of the Earth's crust.
And that is drilling, like that's for drilling for like oil and resources, or is that actually going down that far?
No, that was an experiment that Russia conducted during the Cold War. They were trying to drill a hole to the Earth's mantle.
Okay.
And they made it like 2% of the way there, and then the drill got so hot that it melted, and that was the end of the experiment. So all of which is to say, there is I mean, this isn't like subterra nullius, right? Like there's geology down there, there's biology down there, there's archaeology down there. There's a lot of considerations that we need to think about before we just start, boring everything out and
sure, because
and
there's got to be
bunkers.
sinkholes. There's the seismic stuff. There's the
Geothermal activity.
Sure.
Yeah, all sorts of stuff going on down there. But
like what are we going to trigger? Are we going to trigger Yellowstone by digging to, prevent, survive Yellowstone?
Completely.
Yeah. Jeez. So is there any laws that regulate that you know of that in terms of how deep you can go? Because I know in Canada, anything below 6 inches of soil or something like that belongs to the Queen, apparently, or Justin Trudeau or somebody. Is there regulations on, you talked about Elon digging under LAX. I mean, how far is, the government in control of, as far as you know?
They're not, essentially. There's this obscure English law that said, basically a property law that said when you buy a piece of property, you own everything on that property from heaven until hell.
Wow.
So it's like, you've got the full vertical stack. And a lot of countries are now coming in with regulations saying, you don't own that, and we get the mineral rights.
We get hell.
Yeah, and we get to build the metro under your house or whatever we want to do. So I mean, this is something I've been thinking about a lot. As a geographer, I find it totally fascinating, right? That like this underground space is going to be colonized, and like who gets to control it, who gets to own it? Do you have any power to say someone can't? Like in London, this is a great example. In London, wealthy people have been like building massive bunkers. I mean, they're sort of like multi-story structures that are fundamentally bunkers, but it's an underground space. They call them iceberg houses because often the basement area is bigger than the actual house.
Okay.
Right. So you got a little Georgian house on the surface, and then they're digging out these massive basements, but it's causing problems where like subsidence with the neighbors, or like they start digging under other people's property lines, or they go to extend a tube line and then they're like, oh, we just hit a millionaire's basement, now we have to use some kind of like subterranean eminent domain to say we're repossessing that land to build a subway system. I mean, it starts to get really complicated, especially in cities.
Yeah.
So I mean, like I say, as a geographer, this stuff totally fascinates me. I love the underground. That's why I've spent so much time there, I guess.
It seems like a natural marriage of your interests. What do you know about Russia and their capabilities and their facilities?
Oh man, during the Cold War, they invested just enormous sums of money in building subterranean systems. There's a metro system down there called Metro 2, which was basically built in secret, and it connected the Kremlin with like a nuclear launch facility and all sorts of other installations, and it was just for elites essentially to move around. There were some urban explorers there from a group called Diggers of the Underground Planet, and they got into Metro 2, and it was supposed to be derelict, right? Because it's like a Cold War remnant, but they apparently, I hear they sort of like popped over a wall into this thing, and there were guys there with Kalashnikovs, and they were like, yeah, you're not coming in here,
Wow, I'm surprised they made it out.
Yeah.
So it's still active.
Who knows? I mean, this is another closed society. Like, we have no idea what they're building down there.
Guys with Kalashnikovs, to me, signals that they're still, keeping it live just in case.
Yeah, I would think so.
Which would make sense in light of current events.
Yeah.
What do you know about Mount Yamantau? How is that? Am I pronouncing it correctly?
That's another one of those places that is supposedly connected by Metro 2. Mm-hmm. And I think that is essentially like their version of Raven Rock. They've like hollowed out a mountain and built a subterranean military base there. And there's supposed to be a metro line that connects that to the Kremlin. But again, I mean, somebody knows. Yeah. Somebody knows.
Well,
we got into all these abandoned metro stations in London. There are 14 of them, and we basically like had a hit list for 2 years. We were just knocking them out one by one, trying to get to all these stations, and they were really interesting. I mean, some of them had, they hadn't been used since World War II. Like the surface buildings got bombed out, and they just closed them up. But you'd still have train platforms in there. Posters from the 1940s, whatever, it's pretty cool. But, often when we were down there, one of the things that we would think about is like the only people who sees these are the workers. Like Transport for London workers are the only people that see these things. It's so strange.
What about Singapore? This is another interesting city or city-state, I guess it is. What do you know about their subterranean underground city that they're building there?
Yeah, it's totally fascinating. I mean, essentially, they have run out of land. It's a small country, and they just have nowhere to go. And so, you reach a limit building up, you got to start digging down. So they actually created a subterranean master plan. And they have this whole idea of building like multi-level underground structures that are for transport, habitation, shopping. Everything that we do on the surface now is going to go underground. Yeah. And I was talking to one of the guys who was involved in designing the subterranean master plan, and he said one of the trickiest things is light. Because people suffer under artificial light, especially for long periods of time. Mm-hmm. And so they were trying to figure out ways to put in essentially like really complicated skylights that would like refract light and then shoot it into different subterranean environments. Okay. And so they had all of these engineers working on sort of like porting sunlight into the subterranean city. It was really, really fascinating. I watched them give a whole talk on this. It
must be a very energy intensive way of life down there. Like, it must take more energy to live underground than it does above, would you say?
That's a good question. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of people about growing food, and the thing they always say is like, it's great to grow underground because you don't have to deal with weather, you don't have to deal with bugs, right? Like, there's so many external factors that are not a consideration.
Controlled, yeah.
Yeah, it's a more controlled environment, but I think you're right. It's also got to be a much more energy intensive environment to be growing like that.
Yeah, it seems like if we're getting to the point of energy scarcity, but we're we're using more energy to survive in the subterranean, that it's something which is a vicious cycle, I guess you could say. What about, going back to the unknown bunkers? There's all these rumors. And what are your thoughts on the Denver airport? I have to ask. Because it's shrouded in mystery, all kinds of conspiracy, the murals, the
Obama
gargoyles.
Disappeared in there for a while. I mean, that story of Lucifer is so weird. The giant horse.
Okay.
At the front of the airport, it's got like glowing red eyes, and apparently it killed the sculptor. He was like almost done with the thing, and it fell on him and like slashed the artery in his leg, and he died.
Wow.
So yeah, there are all sorts of, this is part of the, like, it's one of the ingredients of like the vast conspiracy theory
right.
that exists
Well,
there.
it doesn't help that they have all the symbolism around the airport with the gargoyles and the NWO insignia and all this stuff.
It's all totally intentional.
You think it's intentional? You think it's a part of like some sort of tourism campaign.
Yeah. I mean, I would like to think that there is a secret bunker there, and that they're so smart that they thought, if we call attention to this as a bunker, then it will like dispel
The myths.
the myths. Yeah. I mean, because they also, I was there at one point, and they had all of this like temporary signage on hoarding where like new businesses were going in.
Yeah.
And they were like making fun of themselves.
Right, I
You know,
see
they were
that.
like,
Yeah, yeah.
aliens are behind this, whatever.
Yeah. Don't mind us. We're just busy digging tunnels to the underworld. That's got this reptile character.
It's definitely the coolest airport on Earth. Yeah, I do think it's just a marketing strategy, but it raises an interesting question though. When governments all over the world built these bunkers during the Cold War, we didn't have this system of surveillance. Like, can you actually build a bunker in secret anymore? It's a good question. You would have to keep all of the spoils underground, right? Because that was one of the things, is that people were saying, like, there were truckloads and truckloads of dirt coming out from under the airport, right? Being moved
Didn't
around.
they come in like $2 billion over budget?
They did, yeah. And they said that was because of a luggage. It was like an underground luggage system, which sounded like garbage. Like there were supposed to be a bunch of like conveyor belts that would move the luggage across the airport, and then it could just sort of like pop up at the plane.
Right.
So it sounded like garbage, and then I saw a photo of it. I was like, okay, there was actually a luggage system, but
$2 billion.
$2 billion, right? Yeah.
Well, and okay, so knowing what you know about tunnel boring technology, I've always thought that it's feasible then that you could have the mouth of the bunker, you could have tunnels, far off in miles in all directions going to like the main opening, So even if Denver Airport was like a portal into something else, is it feasible with the tunnel boring tech that something like that could happen, where you maybe the front is like the Denver Airport, but because I guess the idea is you don't want to tell the adversary where these are, because then they will just put a nuke on it. But even if you know where the entranceway is to the bunker, with modern tunnel boring technology, I presume that you could just tunnel away from it in miles in all directions.
Okay, I like this. This is a better take for the conspiracy theory. Isn't the NORAD bunker in Colorado?
I do not know. Is that the not Cheyenne Mountain?
I don't know. There's definitely a government bunker in Colorado. I'm pretty sure it's the bunker that that is shielded. They've built it to be shielded from an EMP.
Okay.
But I'm wondering how far that bunker is from the airport, because that would make perfect sense. That they would tunnel through, so that if, say a president needed to get to the bunker and they don't want anyone to know, then they would land at the airport, go into the tornado shelter doors,
right,
and then take the subterranean subway system to the bunker. That would be really interesting, but I don't know if it's too far. I mean, we'd have to do some calculations, like how much does it cost to run a tunnel boring machine? I know you can move through like 15, 20 meters a day of earth, depending on geological conditions. So
which isn't much, really. Well, I guess
it's slow.
Yeah,
it's slow. But does $2 billion get you to the bunker? Maybe. Yeah.
Jamie, what's the prognosis here?
Cheyenne Mountain
is in Colorado.
Okay.
How far is it from the airport?
It's in El Paso.
We're gonna solve this mystery right now. Yeah. We're gonna have loads of people emailing you saying, "This is absolutely idiotic. Why are you guys trying to figure this out right now?"
No, my audience they'll join in the fun. Yeah.
82.1 miles.
82 miles.
That's feasible. If you're talking about 60 miles of underground tunnels in the UK over the course of a few years, I'm sure they could get there.
Yep. Okay, so now the longest tunnel in the world ever excavated by a tunnel boring machine was in Switzerland.
Okay.
Under the Swiss Alps. So we
And
know.
how long was that?
I can't remember, but we know that's feasible.
Is it in the hundreds of miles or is it in the tens of miles?
I see.
I presume it'd be in the hundreds because
No, it's not that long. I don't know, but who's to say? I mean, this comes back to our conversation about what we don't know.
right.
I mean, who's to say that's not the longest tunnel in the world dug by a tunnel boring machine?
Yeah.
We don't,
Because tunnel boring machines are they the only way to dig these tunnels, or are there other ways that they've dug them historically?
It's the most efficient way.
Okay.
But of course, you have to remember, it's like a worm, right? So you're basically going straight.
Well, how long is the channel?
Oh, that's a good question. That took a
That
very
must be 100 or so miles.
yeah.
No? Well, I'm just thinking like subway, the metro is hundreds of miles, depending on the city. How long is it? 31.5. Okay.
31.5. And the channel tunnel was one of the most expensive projects in history. So, I mean, it's like up there with the Apollo space program.
Right.
So yeah, tunnel.
Billions.
Yeah, tunnel for $2 billion. I don't think you're getting to Cheyenne Mountain,
Huh.
unless they have tunnel boring machine technology we're not aware of.
And I guess not all Earth is going to be the same. Like you're going to be able to move through some stuff much easier.
Hard rock's way easier.
Hard rock's easier.
Hard rock's easier, yeah, because if you've got like soft sand or clay, it like gunks up the cutter head on the tunnel boring machine.
Really?
Yeah. I'm a total tunnel boring machine geek. You don't want to go down this path, but yeah, I mean,
I want to go down that rabbit hole a little bit more, literally.
But yeah. So, but imagine it's going in a straight line. Yeah, hard rock is a lot easier to cut through because you're just like grinding it up essentially. But then you've got all sorts of other problems, like you could hit geothermal vents or asbestos, naturally occurring asbestos. There's like all sorts of things that make it exponentially more complicated. So in London, when they excavated the tube, like you'll notice that most of the tube is north of the river. It's because it's hard rock. South of the river, it was like clay and sand, and it was a disaster to try and dig through. In fact, one of the places that I snuck into with the Urban Explorers was an abandoned tunnel boring machine. So in 1974, they were using this experimental machine that basically was supposed to like inject a fluid in front of the cutter head on the machine that would like keep the clay and sand from gunking it up. And it kind of worked, and then it got stuck, and they just abandoned it. And yeah, we went down there, and it's still there, like rusting out under the earth. Like it's like it dug its own grave. It was totally fascinating to find this thing and then like climb around in the tunnel boring machine, and it's not something you normally get to do. Mm-hmm. It's one of those secrets of the underworld that doesn't get exposed very often.
So do you think then that, knowing that this is your next line of interest is the tunnel boring machine, so it's a natural progression from the bunkers. What are your plans on how to research this, and what are your next moves with respect to learning a bit more about how this works?
Yeah, so I Explore Everything, my first book, was very much about exploration of the underground, mm-hmm. Finding those things that people try and hide. And I feel like Bunker is really about habitation of the underground. We're starting to move into these spaces. And this new book that I'm thinking about writing, I'm just putting together the book proposal now, but this is about colonization of the underground. Like in the same way that we imagine we've colonized land and maybe we're going to colonize space. These tunnel boring machines are kind of like the linchpin to colonizing the underground. It's also the case that, if we didn't start digging tunnels, like cities would be impossible as they currently exist. Like you need to have subterranean infrastructure. You need to have sewer systems. You need to have electrical tunnels. You need to have subterranean transport systems. Like all of these things are being built by tunnel boring machines now. And this is only a 250-year-old technology. It was...
I'm surprised it's that old.
Right. Well, it was Brunel in London in the mid 19th century who first developed what he called the tunneling shield, and he tunneled under the Thames with this thing, and that was the first tunnel that was built under a flowing body of water. But essentially, it's like plates that hold the Earth back. I mean, it's like Atlas holding up the Earth,
Right.
As at that time, then workers would go into the front of the machine and they would sort of like open these doors and then dig it out and then they would move it forward, right? So now this is, of course, it's all automated.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I'm really interested in is like what happens when artificial intelligence starts driving the machines, right? So we could start feeding all of this data into the model. So we've got all sorts of data on geology, subsurface geology. You could feed that to the machine. It would know exactly what kind of environment it's going to encounter. And then you could essentially just set it loose. This is the key, I think, to lunar tunnel boring machines, which is the only real viable way to build a lunar base. It needs to be underground. I found this amazing paper from NASA from 1988 where they were saying that a lunar tunnel boring machine was actually feasible at that time. The problem was getting the equipment to the moon. Mm-hmm. But now with the Falcon Heavy rockets, I mean, I guess you could feasibly get the components up there, and then assemble it and then set it loose, right? And it can you just leave it up there for a couple of years and let the AI drive it. You could build an underground moon base.
So what you're saying is...
So with every book, my thinking gets weirder. That's what I'm saying.
What you're saying is at some point we're going to be met by an alien race of tunnel boring robots that, inevitably that's bound to happen. Isn't that a Fermi's paradox sort of thing?
Oh, yeah, completely. Yeah, the whole thing fascinates me. And so I'm putting together this proposal now, trying to essentially like tell the history of the tunnel boring machine, which is absolutely fascinating. All the different like models and experiments that were conducted, all the way through, the future of the tunnel boring machine and like what could be done with it. But it's also a book kind of about tunnels generally.
I have a feeling that, you're going to stumble on some information that you're not supposed to know. Mm-hmm. Because
I usually do.
With your background and knowing so much about the subterranean underworld, and now that your research is going to take you into the tunnel boring machines, you're going to figure out, okay, well, where are the machines being used? Who owns the machines? Where are they located? And you can't help but start to make inferences about where the bases are, where the DUMs are, the deep underground military bases, I think at that point. So you never know where this is going to lead you. Let's just hope that you're not going to be, I was going to say barking up the wrong tree, but that's not the right metaphor. Digging the wrong hole.
Yeah. Speaking of digging holes, when they were digging the Jubilee line in London, it went like basically past Parliament and Scotland Yard. Like there was a bunch of stuff going on there underground. And I talked to one of the guys that worked on that project, and he said, when they asked for like basically they're going through the like planning where to excavate this thing. They kept sending in their plans, and the government would send them back and say, you need to move it, so many meters this way. And they would ask why, and they would say, it's none of your business. You need to move it over there. And so when we were doing urban exploration, we sort of like went through this process of elimination. We were like, okay, we know there's an electricity tunnel here, and we know there's a tube line here, and we know there's something in between those that the government didn't want to mention, right? So essentially, by a process of elimination, we figured out that there were secret tunnels that were connecting Scotland Yard to Parliament and a few other things. And we went into the electricity tunnel and found a bricked up archway, And we never did it, but I'm pretty confident that if we chipped out one of those bricks, we would have, like seen David Cameron at the time, walking around in this tunnel, or we would have been vanished or whatever. Yeah. But this is one of the cool things about research, right? Is like you spend long enough thinking about something and you start revealing things you're not supposed to know.
Would you say that we're on a collision course towards catastrophe, or are you still hopeful for the future?
Yeah, I think we're fucked.
Yeah.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.